Totally for a moment here. Wow, welcome everybody. Like this is like we're proud or something. I mean, this is great on a rainy day. I'm so excited. So thank you all for making it up the hill. I'm Vera Trainer. I'm the Marine Science Director here at ONRC, and I'm very excited to welcome Miles Micheletti to the Rosmond Evening Series to give the talk tonight on drones, using drones to map our forests, right?
Yeah.
A little bit of background, he's been the Unmanned Aircraft Systems Data Manager for the Washington Department of Natural Resources and Forestry Inventory Program since 2017. A Seattle native, graduate of Evergreen State University. Miles started at DNR as an intern before taking a job with DNR. So I'm going to let him go ahead and give you the talk about what he does. And welcome, thanks for making the drive up here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really excited. We're expecting a studio audience of, two to three people here. So this is really, really great to have such a lively crowd, and they've brought good treats. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm, as Vera said, I'm Miles Micheletti. I started with DNR about 10 years ago. In fact, almost exactly 10 years ago was January. As a little bit of background, yeah, I was an Evergreen graduate, like a lot of our forest management colleagues out here are. I did 2 years of study at the Shoreline Community College before going to the Evergreen State College. Took some pretty amazing ecology, forest management, and GIS programs. In 2013, I actually made it out here as part of a class field trip. We saw the Elwha Dam site of immediately post-restoration. It was amazing. I distinctly remember being in the dorms and not being able to sleep all night, and it was super loud. So it's very exciting. It's cool to be back and be able to speak here now. It's like, feels very full circle. I think that's a good intro about me. I will give a little bit of an introduction about tonight's, about tonight's presentation. Broadly, we're just going to talk about drone stuff in environmental science and landscape management, how we're using drones. I have a couple of examples about ways that DNR has been using drones here on the peninsula. I also want to talk about sort of predictions for the future and what that might look like in 5 years. There's kind of a third secret objective to this presentation, which is that, the advantage of drones is that they're really accessible. It's really easy to do drone work. It's definitely a paradigm shift for remote sensing. It is not the same kind of super costly platform like aerial imagery or aerial LiDAR. And it's accessible to small forest landowners and small municipalities. So kind of the secret goal of this presentation is that, if that applies to you and this is something you're interested in, I'd love for you to come out of this feeling, empowered and enabled to use drones in your work. So those are the sort of the two big topics. And maybe one disclaimer, which is that, not knowing exactly who is going to attend and be interested, I've tried to strike a balance between making this really accessible to people who have no drone experience at all and still useful for people who work in forest management and remote sensing. So if you are in the former category and you get lost, please stop and interrupt and ask a question. And if you're in the latter category and you see this next slide, which is about to say, what is a drone? And you go, oh gosh, no, have some patience. We'll get to the nitty gritty stuff too. Can I just ask if, by show of hands, is anyone here who works in forest management? Any forest professionals? Super cool. And yeah, awesome. I think that can good for you. That's the dream. What about, do you use remote sensing as part of your forest management? Awesome. Okay, cool. So maybe a helpful background is let's just get on the same page about what we're talking about when we're talking about drones. I actually did bring the drone that I used for virtually all of this field work that we're going to talk about. We at the state are lucky to be able to use these DJI drones. Still, that's not necessarily true if you're in the federal government. But yeah, reasons. There's a lot of debate about if they're made in China, and they're pretty far and away the industry leading drone manufacturing. There's a lot of debate about how to support drone manufacturers in America and what data we're sharing with China. And rightly, it's definitely, these are open and important questions that we often answer. I think for us, a lot of the view about it is that, we're mapping public lands. This is all stuff that, if the Chinese government wants to see our trees, they can look at the trees and that's totally okay. It's more complicated than that, but ultimately we are still using this equipment because it is by far and away the best performing for the price. This drone costs somewhere between $5,000 and $6,000. It has a multispectral camera, and it is like an enterprise grade mapping drone with an RTK sensor, but it's not a super sophisticated one, and it is more than adequate for anything that we have wanted to do here. It's been a really amazing platform. Legally speaking, drones are regulated by the FAA, and they have some size characteristic limitations. They all have to be less than 55 pounds, but there's some sort of subcategories if you're going to fly with people. They, as a remote sensing tool, their thing is that they take photos. That's what turns them from a model aircraft into a remote sensing tool. And if you're interested in using one, if you're interested in using one commercially, including for an educational institution, like as part of a nonprofit, you need to get your Part 107 license. And it's a 60-question multiple choice test. It costs like $175. It is super doable. It is really, I've had people describe it as the easiest professional licensing test you'll ever take. It is, 6 to 10 hours of studying. I know it's a little bit, the first part of it is really steep learning curve. You have to learn a lot about airspace requirements. Basically, the entire test is that they just really don't want you to hit an airplane. That's like their whole thing, is they don't want you to hit an airplane. And once they're confident that you can do that, then you'll pass the test. For us, it's important that we can fly them manually or autonomously. Most remote sensing work with drones involves autonomous flight planning. And it's pretty easy. There's a lot of software that's out there to help you do these flight plans. This drone that I've got here has a controller that's basically an Android tablet with a screen built in, and I do all the flight planning here on the controller. Other drones you can connect to your phone. There's a space in the controller where you can plug your phone in. But ultimately, it's pretty straightforward. It's basically like we're using a tablet app to do mission planning, and it's as simple as importing a polygon or just drawing your polygon there on the map where you want to make your flight plan. The technological principle that underlies it is called structure from motion, and it's basically the same principle that's underlined stereophotography for many years, but just at a larger scale. And we'll come back to talking about autonomous versus manual flight planning. And if you have more questions about how the software works, basically like what's going on behind the scenes, we could talk about that too. But this is sort of what it looks like. We're out there parking on the side of forest roads, hiking down into riparian areas, which is convenient that the equipment is small enough that we can hike it in, and then taking lots and lots of overlapping photos. And when we come back to the office, we can stitch those photos together into models and maps, and get a lot of value out of them, hopefully. But it's important that we have an idea about what our objectives are going to be. We could talk about this in the adaptive management framework of the OESF. I think that's probably folks are maybe familiar with that. It's this idea that basically, rather than this management environment that is unchanging, we're constantly looking at the effectiveness of our management strategies, reevaluating them, and testing new strategies. And drones and remote sensing in general are a really useful way of helping us evaluate the effectiveness and implementation of our management work. And we do that by modeling forest structure and change. And specifically, like here in the Olympic Peninsula, there are basically two sort of broad types of work that we're doing. The first is that we're using the drone under the canopy to model small reaches of fish-bearing streams. Those are our monitoring reaches. They're about 100 meters long. And it is important that they are under the canopy. We'll see why in a second. We also are modeling larger areas of upland harvest units where we're trying some of the novel like T3 upland harvest methods. And if we are able to repeat those flights in the future, we'll be able to understand how the management activities are affecting the landscape long term. And that's really our goal. Easier said than done, though, especially because these flights under the canopy, this might be the best example of a flyable stream that we can find. It only gets more dense than this, and there's really no way that we're gonna fly an autonomous flight plan in between these trees under the canopy, 20 to 40 feet above ground level. Right away, when we started this program in 2017, that was one of the questions that we were asking is, can we actually do modeling work here? Will it provide any value? And we wanted to keep in mind, like, the goal is basically that we want to see if the management activities that we're doing are having an impact in these monitoring reaches. And we can already collect all this data about water quality and temperature, but we can't really collect data on a large scale about structural change. Somebody can go to this stream and they can say, I think that there's more downwood here. They can count pieces of downwood, but there's no way to basically like build a really detailed map and say, here's where the downwood is, here's where this new pool is developed, this is how the habitat is really changing. So we just went out there and tested it out. We used our oldest drone that we were the most comfortable crashing into a tree and getting wet. And we started flying back and forth and trying to develop a protocol. And I think that, there are some major caveats to this. It is not possible in every stream. We often will get down there and say, I think actually we're not gonna be able to fly this stream, or we'll only be able to fly a section of it. But when we can, it provides us with a new type of data that we just can't collect on the regular way. So here's our protocol that we started going through. First thing, you get down there, you set up your drone, you're wearing waders, hip waders, or chest waders. You power it on and you wait for a GPS signal because the drone can connect to a lot of satellites, but you're down there in this deep forest canyon and it might take a while before it can make connection to enough satellites to be able to get a GPS position. So once you got that, you want to take off and you want to start collecting images. And we found that it's important that you basically fly perpendicular to the stream. So we're going back and forth across the stream in our crosshatch pattern. The reason why is that that's the long axis of the photo. And if you fly forward down the stream and back and forth, it's easy to get little gaps and have the model not stitch together well. We take photos on a time lapse, basically on a 2-second interval, and we leave the autofocus on and set the shutter speed pretty fast so that the photos don't get blurry. And there are plenty of problems with these photos. I don't know if you can tell, but this photo even here is a little bit blurry. It's me walking through one of the shots. We don't need to add to those by having the photos be blurry from the drone's motion. Then we just try to go as high as possible. In a lot of cases, there will be small gaps in the canopy that we can fly up into to get a wide level of coverage. And we just go slow. It takes about an hour to fly 100 meters of stream. And it's about usually 2.5 batteries for the drone to get through it all. It's helpful to have a second person there. It's not totally necessary, but we always do it with 2 people to have somebody to carry your equipment and just kind of keep awareness of what's going on and whether you've accidentally flown past the end of the stream monitoring reach, or if there's a section that you missed. It's just nice to have another person there. And when we're done, hopefully we're going to end up with something that looks like this. And it's kind of, it's a little bit of a jumble, especially compared to what I showed you earlier in a sort of traditional automated mapping flight. But you can still sort of see the principle here is that we're capturing a bunch of overlapping images of this entire 100-meter reach of stream. And this is pretty good. This is about a best case scenario. There's no major gaps in it. You have total coverage. And when we've got this all modeled, we can build a nice looking ortho mosaic from it. And this is kind of like 80% of the way there to being able to use this remote sensing data to evaluate the effectiveness of our management activities. It's super high resolution. It's really cool. I remember once I printed one of these out on the big Epson plotter, and if you're in ArcGIS and you're adding layers in it, it'll give you a little scale bar. And I set it up and the scale bar went to inches. It's like, that's something I've never seen on a map that I printed before. They're incredibly detailed. On the order of millimeters per pixel, we can see really, really clear detail. Paradoxically, they're also pretty messy. It's like the worst possible conditions for photogrammetry. There's a lot of reflections from the water, stuff's moving around. Even the prop wash from the drone is moving, the fern fronds, and the lack of a really even spacing means that you do tend to get gaps in the data. So it's kind of a weird mixed bag where the imagery is really, really high resolution, but it's also pretty messy. And that's kind of a challenge for what we want to do, which is basically take this photo, which is a pre-treatment photo. And you can, hopefully you can see that this is basically, it's kind of a wide, shallow, riffly stream without a lot of downpour and without a lot of structure. And then take a post-treatment photo here where we have added some down wood and see a pretty major structural change. A traditional change detection method for this would be that we would make our first model and we would make it into an elevation model. We would make our second model into an elevation model, and we would compare the difference of the two. And it would show us really clearly, oh, there's this new log here, it's showing up bright red. It's really obvious that there's something's changed or we're missing a log from before. But that really only works if you can stitch your data sets together really clearly. And because these are so messy, that was hard to do. So our super awesome fish biologist, Kyle Martins, came up with this pretty awesome method. Kyle basically interprets the images and does a vector drawing that shows the stream channel, it shows the actual stream flow, and then down wood is drawn in brown. And it's, in some ways, it's kind of emblematic of like my idea of the perfect remote sensing philosophy, which is that we're not relying on the data to give us a number and tell us exactly what the answer is. We're trying to create data that we can use to make decisions and empower people who are subject matter experts to have a good interpretation of what's going on in their landscape. So that might be a nice segue to talk about some of the other work. We'll talk about some of the upland work. First, I totally need to give a shout out to the ONRC summer interns who were amazing and collected a ton of data for us. It was really a pleasure. I got to work with them twice over the summer. They put out, among other things that they did, they put out thousands of paper plates as visible monuments inside of the sites that we flew, which was, I think, quite a task. I know Courtney got just stacks of thousands of plates, and they went out there. And in areas where they sampled vegetation, they left these visible monuments so that we can tie the drone imagery back to the studies that they did on the ground. So it was really nice working with them, and they're doing well. Also, similar philosophy of remote sensing, that it's important to basically set us up so that we're collecting data and then comparing that data to things that we've learned on the ground. The data is not the solution in and of itself. We're still learning things from our field work that then informs how we use remote sensing. The upland flights that we've done are, if you're familiar with drone work, they're really straightforward. It's totally just this is like your classic drone mapping. There are these units that are probably not larger than 100 acres. And we just get out there and we've got our automated plans and we send the drone off and it flies the whole thing. It needs no input. You're sitting there holding a controller and basically going, okay, I think everything's looking good, good job up there, buddy. Come back when you need a new battery, and it does everything for you, which is good. There's maybe a theme here about technology and not wanting it to get, have too much control. But it means that we can fly pretty substantial amounts of imagery, which is great, because the T3 watershed experiment covers, I think, over 2,000 acres of upland harvest units, and we've flown a pretty substantial number of them. I think we've flown more than 1,000 acres now. It does still beg the question of why, because we do have a lot of access to other remote sensing data. Washington State pretty much fully covered with LiDAR data now, which is incredible. It would have been really hard to even imagine that happening 10 years ago, and now it's like anywhere in the state you can get LiDAR data. We also have really high quality traditional aerial imagery, which is what we're looking at here. This is the 2023 MAPE imagery flown by the USDA, not the Forest Service, but the standard USDA. And in the world of aerial imagery, this is good. It's like a 1.2 foot pixel. It's frame based, so it's actually a photo. Like the camera is taking photos. It's not just a push broom sensor that's taking one line of pixels at a time. They take stereo pairs, they fly in good weather. Really, all told, it's good stuff, and we pay a lot of money for this. Or we did back in 2023, and we were supposed to get another flight in 2025, and we didn't, and it's really up in the air whether we're ever going to get one again. Yes, which is really, it's unfortunate, and it's kind of, this data is critical to us in so many ways. This is like the backbone of our RS-GRIDS, our remotely sensed forest inventory system that we use. And using the same technology, the same photogrammetry technology, it really, we are asking big questions now about what if we can't get this data next year? Well, what if they don't do a 2026 flight or a 2027 flight? That's kind of an important question for us. But even in the drone world here, we can get a lot of value out of doing a drone flight of this. I'll flip back and forth so you can kind of see the difference. You know, this is the 2023 Nate flight, and this is my flight from earlier this year. And we can go from a 1.2 foot pixel to a 2-inch pixel. We can fly at the time of our choosing. We can fly immediately post-harvest if we want to. We can fly 6 months post-harvest. We can fly 5 years post-harvest, and there's no limit. We can do all of these. This flight of this gap treatment took, I think, 5.5 minutes to do. It's super fast and efficient. You know, 100-acre units take 40 minutes maybe. And it gives us a lot of control over two things that are really important to us, which are spatial resolution and temporal resolution. You know, we fly when we want, and we can fly with the level of detail that we want. And this is flown at the maximum altitude that we're legally allowed to do, so it only gets more detailed here. Again, it's not really a solution in and of itself, so I'll kind of like walk through the products that we typically produce. To give you an idea of what things, you know, as an easy sort of off-the-shelf, easy-ish off-the-shelf solution, what we're producing. The first is this visible spectrum mosaic. It has huge value. I would say its biggest value is that it basically is an as-built for how management activity was conducted. We can fly post-management at exactly the point that we want, and then we have this permanent visible record of what it looked like and what happened on the ground. And if there are questions later, if we have questions about wind throw or whether the contractors did things the way that we expected them to, we can answer that with this. If we have questions about planting size and what areas need to be planted, we can answer that with this. We also produce a multispectral mosaic. This drone, I don't know if you can see it here in the room, but it's a little camera here. It's got like its sort of main camera, and then it's got these 4 additional sensors on top. It has a dedicated red and green sensor, and then it also collects near infrared and red edge data. So we can produce some spectral metrics from it, like the classic spectral index, which is the normalized difference vegetation index, NDVI. This is like maybe the most widely referenced index in the literature. You can say that it sort of measures, it's useful for measuring things about plant health and presence. And it basically distills the visible spectrum or the red edge and near infrared data down into a single indexable number that we can then classify and make decisions about what kind of canopy cover we have and what levels of competing vegetation we might face and how many acres have been planted or should be planted or should be treated, those kinds of questions. It allows us to take as a population census things that we might normally in the past have done with sampling, which is good and bad. You know, sampling has when you're physically there on the ground, you can collect information that we can't with the drone. But at the same time, we can avoid some sources of sampling bias and start to learn things about spatial distribution with the drone that we can't learn just from a sampling perspective. There's one more thing that we produce that's maybe kind of the star of the show, and it is a individual tree detection. These tools are really, really cool, and I'll stop and give another shout out for Bob and Goy at the Forest Service, or recently retired from the Forest Service, who developed the tools that we use for tree detection. They are super powerful. They are free and open source. I have a link at the end of the presentation to not only the tools, but I have sort of a sample workflow and data sets to use, because this is kind of the crux of the process for a lot of things that we do that are silvicultural in nature, where we're really concerned about tree size and density. We want to know if we stock things correctly. All those questions are really, really answered well by being able to segment out individual trees and actually say how many trees we've got in the landscape and what their spacing is and what size they are. So this is a really powerful set of tools that we couldn't do it without the fusion LiDAR tools that Bob developed. I think they're dead. I think they're dead. Yeah, I think they're dead first. I actually don't even remember where. This is a pretty young stand, so this is probably like 7-ish years old. many of the applications, we do this tree segmentation for the upland units post-harvest. And there are some really interesting applications for like leaf tree counting and spacing is probably the biggest one. Our HCP implementation monitoring team has been using drones or testing the use of drones to basically see if we can better understand the distribution of leaf trees on the landscape, because it's really, it's like, it's a huge thing, getting your leaf tree counts and spacing right is really important. And hypothetically, this could be a really good tool for that.
Is there any ability to distinguish species?
That is such a good question. Not at the moment, but that is probably the biggest standing question at the moment. And I think that the tools to be able to do that are maybe newly available to us. The difficulty is that the imagery that we're working with is like, it's usually either visible spectrum or we have these additional spectral bands, but it's just some things are really difficult to distinguish even with a pretty like well-regarded index like NDVI. And tools like machine learning and deep learning, I think, are the things that will be able to tease out the complex relationships that happen at a stand level, where we could potentially, train models to be able to look at images like this and say, we might not be able to say, look at each of these trees and tell me what that tree is, but we might be able to train a model and say, look at this entire stand and tell me what the composition is based on these other stands that I've trained on, or, 80% Douglas fir, 10% Western hemlock, and 10% other things. There might be able to test that. But that is kind of the holy grail.
What's the youngest you do that?
Probably you need to be able to, the algorithm relies on shape. Basically, it's looking for like a Christmas tree shape, and so it needs to actually be distinguished from the landscape. So as soon as you can like see the tree on the ground as a tree that doesn't have a super floppy leader, you can do it. But I would say safely like 3 to 5 is probably the best. And there's probably methods other than this for younger trees if you're interested in like an immediately post-planting like stocking survey. Because they're visible, you can see them if you don't have a ton of vegetation. You just have to basically see them and identify it. So we've experimented with a method where basically you put it in a network of random plots. And then like in GIS, not on the landscape, you might go into GIS and like say, put a plot in here and give me a 10-acre buffer, and then I'm going to go in and count all the trees in there. It'll take you, about a 10th of the time that it will take in the field. And hopefully be close to as accurate, but that's kind of the question. Being able to see the trees is the key. It's so about 3 to 5. It's usually where it starts to work. It's kind of maybe a good segue into talking about this topic, which is kind of it's a little bit the why question. I wanted to talk about what we're learning about our methods and how we're using them, but also like reflections about developing the methods. And I think that probably the biggest important key to this work is that there are a lot of opportunities to basically take an existing data collection method and just plug a drone into it. You do a silviculture survey and you measure these things, you measure species and height and DBH. And so how do we make the drone do that? Measure species, DBH, and height. But it's really important to kind of go back a step and for us basically say, well, why do we want to know these things? What are the things that we're learning? At the very most basic level, we want to know about the implementation and effectiveness of our management. But like, what specifically about this young stand do we want to know? Well, we want to know if we've made a good investment and if the trees are growing well and if they're spaced out nicely and if we have any areas that are unstopped, or big areas that have died. And with that in mind, it's really, I think, important to like, as we're reevaluating drone methods, start from scratch to a certain extent and ask those questions again. And the other thing that's important is to set ourselves up for success later. This data is valuable now, but we're talking about change detection and about how our management activities are going to, change landscapes over long periods of time. So we want to be able to collect good things now so that in the future, we're happy with what we did. Which is maybe, you know, a nice time to talk about kind of the other topic of this presentation, which is a shorter topic, is just what do we have? Sure, what is going to happen with remote sensing, you know, specifically with drones, but also with remote sensing at large. Right now, we're in this space where there is pretty widespread adoption of drones in natural resources management. Even at a small level, people are taking drones out and they're making maps and models, and they're using that data for their management activities to see how well they're doing and what they can do differently. But a lot of it happens at a pretty, you know, the same sort of level that a lot of modeling work happens at, that you would think of. You know, if you remember from your statistics class, if you remember the way that models are built, you're like, we're talking about, you know, you've got your response variables and you understand what is going into these models. It's not like when we build a forest inventory model, we don't just, you know, take the data that we have and take the results that we want and say, well, you figure it out. You figure out how to make this model computer. That's kind of what's going, I think, to happen a little bit more in the future. And I made this diagram of sort of the hierarchy of these different technologies, because all these, like these words, you know, especially AI gets thrown around a lot. You're probably familiar with machine learning. You work with remote sensing data, and then there's this idea of deep learning, which is kind of a subset of it, and they all sort of are talking about the same thing to a certain extent, which is basically training computers to make decisions using large volumes of data with supervision or maybe without supervision, which is, you know, pretty distinct from the ways that we've made models with computers in the past, which are supervised and where we understand what we're telling the models to make decisions based on. You know, like in our inventory model, we got a really good model for basal area. And that model for basal area is made based on you know, components of the data we understand. It's like it has to do with the first returns in the photogrammetry file. These technologies, AI, machine learning, and deep learning, it's a different paradigm where instead you're basically saying to the computer, here's 200 images of these stands. Here's what I know is in these stands. You know, I'm saying that there's an orthomosaic and I know this species composition is this. Now I'm going to give you this other image of a stand and you tell me what's in it. And you don't have to tell me how you know that. And I'm not going to tell you how to make that decision. You're going to come up with the variables on your own, which is super powerful. And it's also kind of scary. I don't know if anybody was watching the Board of Natural Resources meeting last Tuesday. I think that to do with that. There was a presentation about the East Side's State of the Harvest calculation that DNRs are preparing right now. It's like it's an extremely complex task. And you know, they poured through these thousands of pages of regulatory frameworks that are really conflicting, and mainly
Is that West End ONRC forestry group. There's only 8 people tuned into their meeting with these grad students discussing.
This board meeting, you know, basically they're talking about the complexity of making this sustainable harvest calculation. And at one point the commissioner of public lands asked me, well, why not use AI to make this decision? And that's kind of a big question, you know, of why would we do this or would we not do this? You know, I think people are we're aware that AI is impacting our lives, but we're not really sure how. And, you know, specifically for us in the natural resources profession, we're not really sure what that's going to look like for the management. I think there are some things that are going to be they're very promising for this kind of model making. Species is the big one. It's the question that is the most pressing. People really want to know about species composition, and rightly so. And with the possibility of making detailed species models is like, you know, newly available to us, basically. So there are some other questions about like complex systems, ecosystems, where the relationships may not come down to variables that we can understand in the data, where we're not saying like, well, you know, I know that basal area is correlated with height, so this model is based on height. It's about saying maybe these difficult to model habitat characteristics like downwood have complex relationships with the landscape that I couldn't tease out. But if I provide a large amount of data, maybe the computer can tease it out for us. The things that are tempting but not practical are things like long-term planning, decision making. You know, like the sustainable harvest calculation, where you might be able to get an AI to spit out a really tempting answer, but you're not going to have a lot of accountability for it, and you're really not going to be sure like what decisions it's making, because that's the downside of this technology, is that it's really hard to have transparency in those kinds of models, because the decisions that they're making behind the scenes aren't decisions that could even be transparent to people, because they're not based on variables that we would be able to say, like height and DBH. I think that, this could look like a couple different things for us. The stand level species model is, I think, pretty accessible. The individual tree level model, like, oh my gosh, it would be great to get time and money to be able to try and collect this data and train these models. And there are so many open questions about the things that we've always struggled with remote sensing, especially downwood. Some of the key habitat components for like more complex forests, that it would just be really interesting to see if modeling approaches like this could help us understand some of that. I think that what it won't look like for us is probably using these deep learning algorithms to make long-term planning decisions. Actually, maybe I'm gonna switch really quickly. I'll show you guys. I wasn't actually gonna do like a live demo or whatever, but I was thinking about that Eastside sustainable harvest calculation. And so I was like, what would happen if I asked ChatGPT, come up with a sustainable harvest calculation for us? I want you to take into account the trust mandate that DNR provide revenue to its beneficiaries in perpetuity, and I want you to take into account the complex legal framework. And by golly, look at this. It spit out a pretty complex framework for a sustainable harvest calculation. And it just did this. It was just like, wow, look at this. It knows that we have an HCP, it knows that we have SEPA. Incredibly tempting to do something like this. But why would this never work? Well, because we're trust managers and we're accountable to our beneficiaries. And there's no way of understanding how it made these decisions. I know for a fact that in these planning meetings, they spent 30 days, literally 30 days, like going into the nitty-gritty of these policy questions. There are like really, interpretation was key. People argued about wording for days. And I know that that's not happening here, but I don't know what is happening. And it's just, I think that the question to use tools like this will continue to come up and be really tempting and promising. Sorry, I'm trying to go and actually use like this guy again. Let's see, perfect. We will continue to see the implementation of things like AI in our lives. And it is not to get on the soapbox, but it's pricing stuff at the grocery store, it's pricing your rent, it's making decisions about flights. And maybe in the forest industry, maybe in private industry, we'll see more of that. But I think that, for public land managers, that accountability is always going to be a sticking point, and we're never going to be able to just say, hey, model, tell me what the right answer is. And it kind of comes back to that same idea that we were talking about earlier, that like the remote sensing is a decision-making tool, but it is not giving us the right answer. And it's pretty much the same answer here. It may be able to help us answer complex questions, but it's not going to give us the answer. And the other thing that I don't think it's ever going to do is replace field data collection. Maybe someday there will be this incredible technology that'll fly between the trees and capture DBHs and species and stuff. But ultimately, we'll always need to base what we learn with remote sensing on things that we have learned in the field. And so I think that the era of field work is forever, which is, good, I think, for me. This definitely replaces some tedious work. I had a colleague describe it as toilsome, which I liked. Those kinds of silvicultural surveys that are just miserable, where you're like stomping through blackberries and the trees there's like 3,000 trees per acre and they're 7 feet high, so you can't see anything and it's soaking wet. this is a good alternative for some of those things, but it's never gonna replace the kind of field work that helps us like understand the systems. Right? And with that, I just have a slide of some links to things that are sort of relevant. I included the T3 watershed homepage as well as the upland and riparian study plan, which all those are cool. They have details about the different treatments that are going in, the riparian treatments and the upland units. I had a link to Open Drone Map, which is a free structure for motion software that I think is really great if you have a drone and you're a small forest landowner and you want to use it to be making models. Open Drone Map is awesome. A link to Bob and Boy's Fusion LiDAR tools. This also has my sort of sample data in there. And then a link to the Learning Forest, which is DNR's OESF newsletter, which is super awesome. And this one has a drone article if you're interested in great stuff. And I've got a PDF. If you want these, I've got a PDF and I'll send them to you. But yeah, thanks a lot for coming here, and especially thank you to Courtney and Bernard for inviting me and hosting. This is really awesome. So thank you.
Thanks, Miles. That was really great.
I didn't see anything in the chat, but if I missed it, let me know.
Not yet.
Yeah, go ahead.
We're doing these flags about data. And the data is stored how, or migrated forward how, and archived.
Good questions. These are really good questions and big, like huge questions. I think it's noteworthy that my job title is Unmanned Aircraft Systems Data Manager, and that's like kind of a key. So, high level, we have at the moment 30 terabytes of network file storage for all of our drone stuff, which is a lot. It is rapidly filling up. We have to increase it all the time. It's one of those things where it's like it's pretty easy. If you're a small forest landowner and you want to buy a 26 terabyte hard drive for $600, you can do that. But at this agency IT level, it's like a big thing. We have, as part of our public records laws, we are required to keep all of our aerial imagery for the lifetime of the agency, plus archival forever, basically, which is great. Clearly it's a thing from back when you were like paying all this money for the airplanes to fly over and it had multiple uses. But that's okay, we still do it. We have like an AWS Glacier archive setup. So we produce all the maps and models, we delete the intermediates, and we store the models and stuff on the network where people can access them, and then we shuttle all of the imagery into that Glacier archive. And it's pretty cheap. I forget what we pay. We've got a couple terabytes of data in there now. The photos are smaller than the models and the derivative data. And I think for a couple terabytes, we have like 10, 11, 14 bucks an hour. So relatively small potatoes, I guess. But that is the question. It is hard to strike the balance between doing a good job for your future self and being able to, use this data in the future if you want to, and also not keeping it for too long, because it's like, you're out there walking the timber sale and there's a 70-year-old bottle, and all of a sudden you're like, well, shoot, we're not, we can't buffer this out. At a certain point, everything becomes valuable again, and so there's kind of it's still an open question. Yeah.
You alluded to it right near the end. Will there be a time when we'll be able to just turn one of these drones loose like you're under canopy? Is it just tell it, okay, map that stream, dodge the trees if you have to? Is that in the future?
I suspect it is. I think one of the reasons that the industry hasn't moved that way is because the regulatory framework is really focused on this idea of line of sight. It's really the FAA's view of drones is basically there's one person who's manually controlling one drone and they can see the drone, and that's how it integrates with airspace. And ideas like that, and swarms of drones where one person is basically controlling, you've seen those like drone light shows or whatever, where they're all programmed and they can go together. That same technology could be effective for remote sensing too, but it's currently really difficult to get waivers from the FAA to be able to do those kinds of activities.
Even under the canopy?
The under the canopy we're allowed to, but say that you wanted to send the drone off to fly under the canopy and you weren't going to see it. You know, you were gonna basically stay up with the car and the drone's gonna fly down the hill and go through the canopy. There would be the challenges for like pathfinding, those are solvable. And I think the reason the industry hasn't solved them yet is that it would, if you were, the FAA would never approve your waiver to do that, basically.
I was a pilot once upon a time,
Uh-huh.
and out here on the west side of the peninsula, used to be this was uncontrolled airspace,
Yes, yep,
which means that the rules were pretty lax.
right,
And I'm surprised that there's, unless you're right around an airport,
right.
it's hard to believe that they're that concerned.
I know, and you know, you can, I think that they leave some leeway in the interpretation of the rules, you know, the way that they interpret visual line of sight. But it's also a case, I think, where they basically set a pretty restrictive rule set. And then it's not widely enforced. I mean, it's not like, you know, the police are not out there saying, we're flying the drone at 450 feet rather than 400 feet. So there's, you know, there's nuances there. But it doesn't necessarily cover the type of, you know, the sort of like future drone activities where maybe we'll be able to fly autonomously away from you to collect data in ways that require it to be able to find its own way around, which I think is doable. It's just, we're not there yet. Yeah,
Given multi-spectra capabilities, is there any likelihood of it being able to interpret health and like and see if there's a beetle infestation and if it's spreading?
that's a really good question too. I think the answer is yes in some cases. We've done some testing of bark beetle infestations, and what we found with the multispectral imaging was that it wasn't a slam dunk. You know, it wasn't that we basically flew the drone and then looked at the imagery and saw, oh wow, I can really clearly delineate where this infestation is. You know, you saw in a more detailed way the same thing that you would see as a forester on the ground, which is basically like these trees look pretty unhealthy and it's kind of sporadic, or you know, the imagery was useful, but it wasn't enough. We didn't find it to be enough to be able to clearly delineate a bark beetle outbreak, which was sort of the thing we really want. But I still think it may be possible, and I think that forest health questions, especially, you know, looking at drought stress, things that are like responsive really clearly in trees borefield where you can actually see them from this multispectral imagery. I think that you know, that's a very real possibility, both for trees and for competing vegetation. You know, as we're looking at the effectiveness of like herbicide applications and things like that.
I have a question.
Miles, could I chime in on that answer as well, from ONRC's perspective?
Oh, absolutely.
I was just going to add that we had a research scientist, Allie Kruper, that for part of her master's thesis, looked at Western red cedar on the west side of the peninsula and tried to identify it broadly using LiDAR, and tried also to categorize its health using multispectral, and found that, you know, trying to think about the big picture of cedar health in the Puget Sound and on the peninsula, and found that it was especially hard to collect reliable ground data enough to train a model to detect it in the multispectral. And so that was our limiting factor in all of this, that you just need such high quality ground data. Back to your point, Miles, like we will always need people in the woods doing this groundwork. And it was just too difficult to have the crews really assess cedar health from the ground, trying to understand the canopy. And then if you don't have that data, then trying to train multispectral imagery or LiDAR data to find that somewhere else is really challenging. So that was our difficulty with that.
And Allie gave a talk here about that, right? Am I mistaken that Allie gave a?
She did. I think it was maybe like right before or right after she defended her master's thesis. So yeah, it should be on our on the ONRC website and on YouTube as well.
It's super interesting. Yes, I've watched it. It's interesting, and I would recommend it. And that's, yeah, the difficulty of matching trees measured on the ground directly to a single tree measured from drone imagery continues to be a limiting factor as well. It's really hard, you know, in spite of the best efforts of setting up a really good GPS and taking STEM maps, it's still just a challenge and a lot of work to match those trees out together. And so that makes sense that was a limiting factor. That's been a limiting factor for us as well.
I had a question.
Oh, yes, sorry, thank you.
Curiosity more than experience. So, when you talk about multispectral, you're talking about health. You're
Yeah,
not talking about temperature,
right, although there is.
like. Rising off the trees, so that's sort of thing.
Right, I mean, it's kind of, yes, in our case, you know. That the multispectral camera that we use measures wavelengths that are below the infrared that is related to heat. But there are drones that can measure heat. And it's a similar principle, and I think that some of the same principles about heat stress will apply. You know, this one, they call it near infrared, so it's basically like it's adjacent to the spectrum that would be in like a thermal camera. But close, similar principle.
They asked about that blue stream images,
Mhm.
that blue, was that just a reflection?
Oh, yeah,
Back to the camera?
probably. Oh, this goes.
Here?
Yeah, it's a sky reflection through
Interesting.
the canopy. Yeah, there's, you know, I mean, you can see in a lot of cases visual artifacts on, let's see what else, visual artifacts
Yeah.
like around here that are in the reflections in the water. And whenever there are like, you know, actual tree objects, they model really well, but then the water surface looks super weird. And, you know, I mean, you kind of think of it like you get your photos and this photo is looking from up here and the water surface is reflective. And this photo is looking from over here and the water surface is reflecting this other thing. And so the modeling software just gets really confused with what to do with those reflections. It's a real challenge for like aquatic modeling. You know, there's real applications for this in eelgrass and kelp, and that's a big problem for them.
What percentage is stocking surveys, is the state doing drones?
Ooh, that's a good question. Probably not a huge percent at the moment. You know, last I checked, our total drone like survey, you know, I've got this big mosaic that's got basically everything in it. And the total acreage in that is something like 80,000 acres. So not huge on the landscape scale, but pretty huge on the, you know, imagining a person flying it there with a line of sight scale. I think the total silviculture surveys that I've seen done with drones is something in the nature of like 600 to 800 would be my guess. And I'm guessing that it's like less than 20% of what we're doing. Regional adoption differs, you know, some regions are like really big on it. Our Southwest Washington region, Pacific Cascade, is like using drones a lot, which is awesome. And we're still working on the integration with all of our other systems because that's kind of the limiting factor in a lot of cases for most, but not all surveys, is being able to like collect the data that the system wants and then, you know, check the boxes basically. Yeah.
I'm just curious, what do you think of the potential first person view drones for beyond line of sight?
Mhm. I think that, you know, and this, I mean, this is sort of similar. I mean, this drone also has first person view cameras and they're very useful for the kind of automated flights where you're like, the drone is in line of sight, but you can't, it's so small that you can't tell what orientation it's at. I'm sure that it would be hugely useful, especially if you can be able to see spatially in a stereo view. The drone, the object sensors on the current level of drones are pretty good at seeing big obstacles, but not very good at seeing small obstacles. And I'm not sure, you know, how well that would translate into first person view, being able to see the kinds of things that like you would want to avoid hitting those small branches. But I think that it's probably only time for, it's good enough to be able to do that. You know.
Yeah, but is there any utility to, I don't know what you're doing for the basically GPS base stations?
Oh, yes, yeah, ground control, yes, huge utility. You know, the drone does record its position when it's taking photos, and it does a pretty good job. It has the advantage of being way higher up than like a ground-based GPS. So, you know, the drone is telling you how many satellites it's connected to. It's like 32 satellites. It's this crazy number. And it's hitting all the constellations, you know, GPS and GNSS and GLONASS and what's the term called? So it's good conditions, but it's still like just a little GPS that's taking photos, it's moving pretty fast. So yeah, there's ground control is super useful. It's just that collecting it is pretty time consuming, and so it has, its place, I think, is in detailed landscape change detection. Like, say you want to measure the movement of a landscape. Base station data is really useful there. For us, trying to measure changes in trees, it would be useful, but the cost of doing it out in the field might outweigh the benefits. But yeah, it has a lot to it.
Well, thank you so much, Miles. Really appreciate you coming on. I wanted just a couple of things to announce. If you haven't signed the sign-in sheet, please do. If you're not on Courtney's mailing list and you would like to get emails about the seminar series, please put your email address. So we have 2 in the new year. Wednesday, January 21st, will be Wes Bromberg from Campbell Global. And then on Thursday, February 26th, will be Jeff McGinley from Pacific Forest Management. So stay tuned. Please come to those evening talks. I really appreciate everybody coming out tonight. And stay dry. And happy holidays, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Take care. Happy holidays.
Thank you.